2 Corinthians, we're still in chapter 7. We got most of the way through it last week, but excuse me, we left off in at verse 13. But remember what Paul is writing these Corinthians about. He's writing them about the comfort that they should, and it's just how he started this book. Really, we see this is a theme throughout this entire letter to the church at Corinth. But it's part exhorting the Corinthians to comfort one another through their trials, and he gives them some commendation. He says that he was comforted when he heard reports back that they were. If you look there in verse 7, Titus came back and he was consoled by and comforted when he heard of their earnest desire for the faith and the mourning that they had over Paul and how zealous they were to continue on in the faith. And remember, this is when Paul, as he describes in the verse before, that he was troubled on every side, outside and inside. And no doubt that this is a common human experience that we can all relate to when you think of the forest with their. I'm sure a car accident wasn't the only anxiety that was in their life at the time. Everybody has daily worries, daily struggles, and boy, you have a conflict and like that hit you. Well, where do you find comfort? Where does the world find comfort? Well. As Christians, we have a never-ending source of this comfort and this consolation through the working of the Spirit, and this is what we're promised. And we all have experienced this, and we all have experienced that Christian peace that can only be offered, like I said, through Christ. But still, it's always good to be reminded of that because it's easy to get bogged down in the mire and in the affairs of this world and you lose sight of the important things. And this is what Paul is writing to the Corinthians, and that we can use as well to clear in our optics, on our scope, if you will, and understand what the mission is, and still how much comfort we can take in this Christian walk. But let's pick up now in verse 13 and finish up 2 Corinthians chapter 7, and then we'll get into chapter 8. Paul writes there in 7:13, he says, "Therefore, we have been comforted in your comfort and rejoice exceedingly more for the joy of Titus, because his spirit has been refreshed by you all." So again, we see this interaction, how this economy works here. The comfort was first given by the Corinthians to Titus, and we see here what kind of spirit he had upon visiting and ministering with the Corinthians, and the joy that he had. Paul says he rejoiced exceedingly more for the joy that Titus had, because his spirit had been refreshed by you all. And isn't that a great description of how that feeling is? If you're ever feeling down, boy, and I've had it before. You are having a bad day. You're distracted by again, the affairs of the world, and it can be somebody you know or somebody you don't know, but you bump into a fellow Christian. I've had it happen. I bump into a church member at Kroger, and just brief little talk, and you just feel refreshed. And this is how that fellowship works. We see here that comfort that was and refreshment that Titus experienced, it passed along to Paul. He didn't just have it for a moment and then went back to his whole hum daily grind. When Titus then went and saw Paul, he still had and was carrying on this refreshed sense of joy, again because of the consolation he received from his visit with the Corinthians, their earnest on the right track and they were doing well in that, and it bred confidence. Not just confidence in a few things, but as Paul writes here, confidence in everything. God truly is at work in the hearts of people here in Newport. But nevertheless, let's go on in verse 1 of chapter 8 and see what Paul has to say about Christian giving. He says, verse 1, he says, moreover, brethren. So moreover, that's different from the last several paragraphs where he says, therefore this, therefore that, right? So he was continuing on. Now he says, moreover. Okay, so we're going to move moreover onto another topic. But he says, moreover, brethren, we make known to you the grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia. So he just got done saying here the last few paragraphs, he was saying how he was comforted by the report that he received from the Corinthians. Well, now he says, we're going to make known to you, we're going to give you the missionary report of the grace of God and how the grace of God was bestowed on the churches of Macedonia. Okay, so now they're going to hear a report, and this should be a comfort to them, just like their report to Paul was also a comfort. And again, why? About what that report is. He says, verse 2, that in a great trial of affliction, well, we see all of these good reports starting with great trials, just like Paul started in back in chapter 7. Now the report from the churches of Macedonia begin with a great trial of affliction. So out of this great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy. Again, an attitude that only can be produced in Christian churches. In spite of great trials of afflictions, joy is abounding. There's an abundance of their joy. Let's read on though in verse 2. He says, so they have a great trial of affliction, but an abundance of joy. And their deep poverty abounded in the riches of their liberality. Look at that there. In this verse 2, again, only can be accounted by the grace of God working in these churches of Macedonia. These two great contrasts in verse 2. Great trials of affliction, but abundance of joy. Deep poverty, but abounding riches of liberality. That liberality means generosity, giving. So we see God Macedonia was on par, much more. They had a lot fewer resources, natural resources. Remember Corinth and a lot of other areas. Remember Corinth was a seaport, and so they had a lot of commerce, a lot of trade, ships coming in, and commerce being conducted there. Well, that led to much more prosperity throughout that entire region. Well, Macedonia didn't have so much. So you can look even through secular history and see that this is confirmed that, well, deep poverty was kind of the norm in Macedonia. So not only did they have trials of affliction, but they also were facing deep poverty. They didn't have a lot of mites to rub together in Macedonia, but because the grace of God was working in them, and again, this is just a report that we had because Paul, like we know, he was in Macedonia at the time, or he had just been through there. And so now he can report back that even though they're facing these problems, just like the problems that he faced, like he described, outside and inside, affliction from the outside and anxiety about their deep poverty on the inside, they still, what was produced in their hearts was an abundance of joy and an abundance of Christian, he even described it as riches in their liberality. Let's read on verse 3. For I bear witness that according to their ability, yes, and beyond their ability, they were freely willing. So what does this say here? According to their ability. This says everything that they could give, they gave. They recognize this imperative of Christian charity, Christian giving, and Paul here is bearing witness to that according to what they had. So you get the idea here that monetarily speaking, it probably wasn't much, but when you look at it as a ratio of the per capita income of the Macedonians, they were giving greatly according to their ability. And he says and bears witness to the fact that, yes, it wasn't just according to their ability that they were giving, but they were giving beyond their ability. So again, no matter what the overall amount was, it's just like the widow that Christ talked about back in Matthew. And if she were to give one mite, if all she had were two, and she was to give one mite to the church, to Christian giving, if you were to give half of all the money that you had, that would be a good offering, right? And that's why Jesus could say that she was faithful in her giving, and she gave up beyond her ability. She had two. She could have given one, which still would have been statistically almost nothing in the coffers there, right? It's not going to provide enough oil for the lamps or something like for more than a few hours. But nevertheless, that was half of all that she had, and she didn't even give that. She gave both of her mites. She had two, and she gave both of them. This is the type of giving that these Macedonians were doing. They might not have had a lot, but boy, they were giving beyond even what they were able to. Again, this is a motivation. We're going to see that here. This is a grace of God. This is what Paul is calling it. It's a grace of God to be able to have a heart that gives. And this chapter is, we're clearly talking about, and Paul's talking about giving of money, and as we know throughout other of Paul's writings, these were collections, particularly at this time, that were to be sent to the church in Jerusalem, because those earliest Christians, the Jews that heard it first and accepted, were deeply impoverished because they were cut out from their society. We know all the history behind that, but this was the initial reason why these churches were compelled to compelled to give so that they could send money so that they could help support other believers in a different region of the world at the time. Well, we also know that giving doesn't have to be just money. There's a lot of giving that can be done with time. There's a lot of giving that can be done with and giving out of their ability. Well, perhaps giving is out of the ability of the time that you have to serve the church, to volunteer, perhaps visit a shut-in or take meals to a shut-in. There are so many things that we can do that comes from a heart of Christian giving, and this heart that we have as Christians is described here by Paul as a grace of God. All right, let's read on. So they were freely bear witness according to their ability, and beyond their ability they were freely willing. So now verse 4, imploring us with much urgency that we should receive the gift and the fellowship of the ministering to the saints. And not only, verse 5, not only as we had hoped, but they first gave themselves to the Lord and then to us by the will of God. So we urged Titus that as he had begun, so he would also complete this grace in you as well. But as you abound in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, and in all diligence, and in your love for us. So again, he's continuing on the commendation to these Corinthians of all that they abound in. He says, see that you abound in this grace also. So he's saying here, because this is part of the gift, part of the fellowship of the ministering of the saints, as he said there. And he goes on to say that you're abounding in all of these other marks of proper Christian walk. See to also that you abound in this grace also. Now that, like I said, having a heart of giving, having a heart of Christian giving is a gift from God. It is a way that we experience His grace, but also having things to give. Again, whether it's money, whether it's time, whether it's food and other goods, either way, the heart of giving is from God, but also the material things are from God. This is what we have to recognize, is that when we are giving, we're only able to give with whatever ability or whatever measure of material goods or time goods that we have to give. So all of these things were first given to us, and this is why we should have this heart of charity and giving to others. So he's, again, commending these Corinthians, who, again, would have deeper pockets, would have been blessed with by the grace of God with more in the material realm. He's saying, see to it now that you also abound in this grace of Christian giving. Verse 8 now. Verse 8, Paul says, I speak not by commandment. So again, this is something that you can't, and this is what the Catholic Church would do back in more ancient times. There would be compelled giving. There would be, compelled giving is taxation. We do enough of that, and that shouldn't be something that the church shouldn't say, well, let me take a look at your finances, and okay, you made X amount. Well, 10% of that is what you owe the church if you want to be a member in good standing here. No, Paul's saying, I'm not speaking in a commandment. This is how God is going to work in your heart, and however you feel compelled to give, you're giving. But good Christian. No, but just like we've seen thus far, this is fruits, right? These are producing fruits, just like the fruit of faith and speech and knowledge, diligence and love. This grace of Christian giving is also a fruit of the Spirit. So it can't be something that you command that thus it is said, thus be done. But you ought to show that fruit. So he says, I speak not by commandment, but he says, I am testing the sincerity. Verba, old Latin phrase. It's deeds, not words. If you say you're going to do something, if you say you love the saints and you're going to give to such and such, but you kind of you think about it later and you hold back or you forget to do it. Well, just like Paul says here in verse 8, well, the sincerity there. If you said something but you didn't act on it, well, he would have to question a bit of your sincerity there. So we see this fruit of love is tested by, okay, well, how much does your deed match your words? Excuse me. And this principle is also shown in 1 John. 1 John chapter 3, we read essentially the same principle that Paul's talking about here in 8 verse 8, where he says that I'm testing the sincerity of your love. Well, in 1 John 3:16, and it's perfectly enough, just as Scripture is perfectly talking about Christian giving. But verse 16, 1 John chapter 3, John says, by this we know love. Kind of sounds like testing the sincerity there, right? If you test the sincerity, well, if you test results come back, well, then you know. And this is exactly what John says. By this we know love, because he laid down his life for us. So we see, what's the source of all of our, and how do we first know love? Well, we first know love by, this is the first giving that produces that gives us reason and ability to experience love is Christ giving his life for us. The most supreme example of giving is what Christ did, and this is humbling to think about the certain fact that Christ had perfect riches. He had the riches of dwelling with the Father in heaven, but he took on the poverty. He took on and you can go through, you read about all of Jesus' life. He was born poor, not beggarly poor, but he was born in we would call it a blue collar, middle class type of a family, maybe even below middle class. His father working as a carpenter for his bread. And Jesus himself said the fox has his hole and the sparrow has their nest, but the Son of Man doesn't have a place to lay his head at night. So we see that he poor in his walk on earth, but he took on that poverty and ultimately gave everything that he had. He gave his life, and this is again what John is saying here. We know love because he gave it all. He laid down his life for us. But let's read on in verse 16. He says, and we also ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. But, verse 17, he writes, but whoever has this world's goods and sees his brother in need and shuts up his heart from him, how does the love of God abide in him? So we see this here. We see this principle, this test, if you will, just like Paul wrote about in Corinthians, John writes about here. If you see a brother in need, how can you say that you love him, but shut up your heart, shut up your pocketbook? I can't. And this is not to say that you need to provide for absolutely everything, but if that brother needs a coat, if that brother needs a few cans of food in his pantry, well. How can you say you love him but shut up your heart from his physical needs? Again, this is this is how we show and demonstrate our love. And boy, I thought I would have got a lot further, but we're out of time already. Let's just read one more verse 9 back in 2 Corinthians, and we're gonna have to close it off there. Verse 9, 2 Corinthians 8. Paul now writes, he says, "For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, that you through his poverty might become rich." So that's the principle that I just mentioned there. He took on the poverty, if you will. He took on the poorness of humanity, leaving the riches that he had in heaven. And why? It was to demonstrate his love for us. And this is then how we demonstrate the love for others, that we give according to our ability. And just like the Macedonians, sometimes we should even give beyond our ability. And it shows a great level of trust in God to provide not only for us personally, but for all of his Christian church. So any questions, comments on any of chapter 8? All right. If not, Brother Randy, would you mind closing us in a word of prayer?